Let's bring in Emily Harding, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies for a little bit more of a breakdown here. And Emily, I guess what was interesting about his remarks was he did kind of allude to the actions of previous administrations. He was talking about the idea of if needed, the U.S. would have a tough, unforgiving, targeted, precise strategy, not like 20 years ago, maybe taking a dig at the Bush administration approach to the war in Afghanistan. What did you gather from this speech with regards to the posturing of the Biden administration as regards to the Middle East strategy going forward?
It struck me as a very defensive speech. It seemed like he was trying to explain a lot of what was going on. And as they say, when you're explaining, you're losing. He seemed to want to answer some of the criticisms that have emerged over the past few days about the way this is carried out. I think to look at this going forward, you really need to separate the response into two different buckets. You need to think about the way that the evacuation went, and those are very specific lessons to be learned. No one can really argue this evacuation went well, despite what the president said. But the other one is the thornier question, and smart foreign policy experts disagree on this, whether it was the right time to pull out, whether we should have pulled out the way that we did, and then what it really means for the CT fight going forward. I think if you agree with the president, then what you think is that it's unlikely that a significant CT threat reemerges from Afghanistan. And if you disagree with the president's policy, you probably take the view, like I do and like many of my colleagues at the agency used to, that Afghanistan is a ripe place for the reemergence of a terrorist threat. It's not so easy to go about prosecuting the counter-terrorist mission in Afghanistan as maybe the president made it out to be.
And Emily, we're getting the closing bell here. Again, all three of the major averages closing the day in the red as we await the final gavel here for the markets to close. Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ all moving to the downside. But Emily, getting back to the story that we have really been closely following over the last several weeks, just President Biden, because going back to what he was saying, you're saying that it sounded like he was on the defense, and I do agree with you there, but he did call it a success. And he was saying that no other country has been able to, has been the biggest airlift in history is exactly what he said. No country has done this in the past. Is there anything that you think over the last couple of weeks that you would call a success from the Biden administration?
Oh, absolutely. I think he was absolutely right to celebrate the success of the airlift itself and to celebrate the heroes on the ground, really, our troops and our diplomats who carried out this impressive and chaotic logistical mission despite the massive challenges they were facing. That, in my mind, is something that we should all be celebrating, to be sure.
Emily, what did you think about the president's remarks that if they tried to pull this operation off and try to start evacuating people in May, which was the original deadline as set by the Ford administration, that there still would have been the same rush to the airports and that it may have been just as chaotic as it ended up playing out in the summer as we saw it play out? What did you think about that argument from the president?
I have to disagree with him respectfully. If we had controlled Kabul, just Kabul, then Americans who were in Kabul would have been able to make their way from the outskirts into the airport much more safely. There wouldn't have been this question about whether the Taliban were going to let people through checkpoints into the airport. The horror stories we heard about the Taliban going from door to door in Kabul and trying to locate those who had helped the Americans in the last 20 years and take out some kind of revenge on them, we probably wouldn't have seen those stories as well. If we had kept Bagram Air Base, we would have had another place to process people. We would have had another runway. If something had happened to the runway in Kabul, it would have been much more orderly if we'd gone about this months ago. Not to mention, as the Taliban moved through the country, they released many prisoners from two prisons located, one in Kandahar, I believe, and one in Bagram. And many of the people who left those prisons turned out to be ISIS-K supporters who I'm sure were there and participating in the plotting against the airport. So if we had started earlier, if we had controlled more territory as we were conducting the evacuation, it would have been much more orderly and I have to think safer.
Emily, we also heard Biden say that the need to protect America against threats elsewhere, that the safety and security of America is not about spending billions of dollars in Afghanistan. What do you think President Biden's foreign policy should look like going forward?
The first thing he needs to do is to make some amends with our allies. We have heard a lot of criticism out of NATO governments, some concern from our allies around the globe that our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way that it happened, indicates that we somehow have a weaker resolve than we did before to support them. That's not the case, I don't think. I think that Biden is truly committed to helping our allies across the globe, but I do think that some reassurance is necessary. I also think that when it comes to the CT fight, what he is saying is a little bit rosy about how capable we're going to be of prosecuting the CT fight inside Afghanistan. It's going to be a real challenge for our intelligence agencies and for our military to be locating and preempting threats. His comments about how we can do it over the horizon here, as we have done in other places around the world, in some of the other places he mentioned, like Yemen or Syria or Iraq or even North Africa, we have the help of close allies. We have access from neighboring countries. We have freedom of movement in many places in a way that we don't now in Afghanistan. So I think he has to be focused on the CT mission in a way that maybe we weren't just recently. And as much as he says he is ready to pivot to pushing back against China's malevolent influence, pushing back against Russia and its bad behavior, I do think that we are, perhaps ironically, going to be distracted by the CT mission in a way that we hadn't been before.
All right, Emily Harding, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks for helping us break that down on Yahoo Finance this afternoon.